أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم. I want to begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. And I want to welcome our friends and guests in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of a conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Salaakhan. I am pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Today's special guest is Dr. Velva Boles, a deeply committed healthcare professional on a mission. Our last conversation with this sister was on January 31st. The program title was Information is Power: What You Should Know About the Coronavirus Pandemic. Today, we're going to pick up from where we left off in January. The theme for today's program is Where We Are Today. First, a little something about our guests, for those of you who didn't catch the earlier discussion. Dr. Boles, Velva Boles, received her medical doctorate degree, her MD, from the University of Pittsburgh, her doctorate of philosophy degree in health sciences from Concordia University. She has a master's degree in chemistry from Duquesne University and a Bachelor of Science degree from North Carolina State University. Dr. Boles' primary instruction and research interests are extraneous biological and chemical processes which impact public health. Published white papers on securing portable water following a disaster using mobile hydration platform, closing the gap in disparity of healthcare for the elderly, and revolutionize modern snacks, reducing incidence of obesity in American youth, reflect her interest in socio-economically driven issues and disparity of medical care available to Black Americans. Dr. Boles is a consummate teacher, having served as an assistant professor in the Department of Biochemistry at Colorado State University and an instructor at Front Range Community College School of Nursing in Fort Collins, Colorado, while in graduate school. She's currently an adjunct professor at Louisiana State University in Alexandria and Upper Iowa University Extension. Dr. Boles has worked in numerous industrial settings over her career, including as a senior scientist for Westinghouse, a senior marketing consultant for Gulf Oil, USA, as a primary care physician in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Missouri, as a clinical medical director, certified medical investigator, laboratory medical director, visiting researcher at the Center for Disease Control, Zoonotic Division in Fort Collins, Colorado, assisting in research on investigating hantavirus, Lyme disease, and dengue fever. And she is founder of Epiphany Enterprise One, LLC. In 2013, Dr. Boles served as the primary physician for ACT's annual mission to Honduras, Central America, to provide clinical care. She has served on numerous nonprofit civic and research training boards in Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Texas, and is a past president of the Alexandria chapter of the Links Incorporated. Dr. Velva Boles is a healthcare professional on a mission. Needless to say, she takes the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, seriously. And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Boles to today's program. Peace be unto you, my sister. Welcome.
Look at it. Good afternoon, and thank you for such an introduction. Whenever I hear it, I start looking around to say, no, he did say Dr. Boles. He said Velva Boles. So thank you very much. What that proves is that I am a consummate student.
Yes.
Learning is a motivation for me, and knowledge is a tool which I like to use and hopefully sharpen those who are listening. So thank you for that introduction.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I wanted our audience to know that we are not talking to a juvenile expert. We have someone before us who is well qualified to weigh in on this very heavy subject that we're going to be dealing with for the next 50 minutes, God willing. Leaping right on in.
Well, I know you mentioned our January 31st was our last discussion. Much has happened in these last two and a half months.
Yes. And that's where I want to begin. Why don't we begin with you sharing from your perspective, some of the most significant occurrences around this pandemic that have taken place since our conversation on January 31st.
Okay, I think it's very important to begin by saying fear should never be a motivation. And I want to always emphasize that when I'm talking to an audience.
Right.
Actions out of fear are seldom the right thing to do. Therefore, let me begin by telling you here in the United States, there are 4 approved vaccines, but there are over 60 vaccines that have been developed and are distributed across the world. Russia, China, and some other countries have chosen to develop independent of what we know of in these Americas. Of the 4 that have been approved by the FDA in the United States, they include Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson. The news media, unfortunately, has been leading the information distribution. And I'm not proud of the job they are doing. So many bits of information are being given without substantiation, without clarification. And those who think they understand sometimes have not gotten the complete story. I don't think it's so complicated that everyone who wants to know more detail should have it withheld from them. And the tenet that I have been proposing since I first started to speak out is vaccinations can help, yes, but I think it's not fair to tell the people there are also parallel alternative ways to 1, prevent death, and 2, stop the spread of COVID-19, and 3, and equally importantly, it can stop these new strands that I'm sure you have heard of from being developed. Too often, in
Dr.
order
Boles,
to... Yes?
If I can just politely, hopefully, interrupt you for just a moment. I'd like for you to weigh in, factor this question into what you're about to say about these alternatives that are out there. And we're gonna play a little video later in the program that I'm gonna want you to respond to, having to do with one of those alternatives. But if getting right to the meat and potatoes of the first question I had on my plate to ask of you, if I had COVID-19, should I get a vaccine?
Yeah. That's an excellent question. If you've had COVID-19 and you had it within the last year and a half, you have antibodies that you have been able to make that responded to what we refer to as the original COVID. as I briefly alluded to, there are new strains. And what that means, the original virus has mutated. And the mutations that are giving more risk to humans are the South African strain, the UK strain, and the Brazilian strain. We now recently have a New York strain. And why we pick out, I think it's a total of 6 that they are watching. These 6 versions or mutations of this virus can circumvent, which means they can still infect you a second time. And because they can circumvent your immune system, it is advised at this time to take the vaccine if that's what you were so inclined to do, because it can help give you added protection. Now, that is the scripted response. What I need you to understand as a consumer, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines do not give you a broad protection. It is very specific to the protein that their messenger RNA will transcribe to. Johnson & Johnson has a broader coverage, and in their studies, they've shown that the vaccine with Johnson & Johnson does prevent severe illness and death from the South African strain, the Brazilian, as well as the UK. So to answer the question, should you take the vaccine, is really going to come down to, do you plan to travel internationally? Because the consensus are you have to have proof of the vaccine before you can travel. Now, saying you've had the disease, you have no certification or proof that you had COVID-19. The United States does not implement the antibody testing as a thing they do routinely. So in order to have proof that you are, quote, protected against COVID-19, you must have proof of vaccination. And that's a recent decision in the airline and other industries, as well as many tourist countries. So should you take it because you want to be healthy and well? That's your choice. Should you take it to provide yourself with fluidity in travel? That may not be a choice. But taking a vaccine after you've had COVID can introduce a little bit more severe vaccine response than if you've never had the infection.
Okay.
I hope
So
that
from
answered your question.
You now know. Yes, it did. From what you now know, is it or is it not possible for these new strains to override the vaccines that are available?
Yes. Yes. You can get infected from these mutated new strains after being vaccinated. The answer to that question is yes. That is a possibility.
Okay.
I think Pfizer has already consented to say next year there's most likely they will have a 3rd shot as a booster for that very reason, and that the pharmaceutical companies who came out early with this very specific messenger RNA vaccine are going back to the lab to modify the type of immune response elicited when they give that 3rd booster.
I had a close friend. She's like family. Her husband contacted me today to inform me that he had to take her to the hospital. She had had her 2nd shot, I believe it was Pfizer, had her 2nd shot on April 1st, just three days ago. And after the 1st shot, she, had soreness and that was about it. But with after the 2nd shot, she began to experience chills and a bit of fever. And what ended up leading them to decide to take her to the hospital is she couldn't stand up. You know, she couldn't stand up. She fell a couple of times, and so he took her to the hospital, and that's where she is now. And they have her under, I guess, is going to be at least 24-hour observation. With that being the case, and what should I expect from a vaccine inoculation?
It is
What should
always
anyone
difficult when you
expect?
have, it's
Go
always
ahead. I'm
difficult
sorry.
when there's a first-hand observation. You've seen a dear friend have an adverse, what would be considered an adverse response, sometimes a delayed adverse response. So I'm going to first answer very scientific and clinical, and then I'll be a little more anecdotal. Scientifically,
Okay.
it is totally expected that a second vaccine or the second shot, can give rise to a more serious response. And the response will look like what you would expect if you had the actual infection. And you would say, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is that possible? Well, the first injection, particularly with Pfizer and Moderna, is introducing a messenger RNA that's a very specific message. The ribosomes in your cells will translate that message into a protein, and it's a very specific protein. So your immune system is educated to that protein, and you generate IgG or antibodies very specific to that protein. When you get your second shot, you can imagine you have your body fully armed to start an immune response to that vaccine, because you delay getting them by 3 weeks, which is adequate time if you have a healthy body to produce antibodies against the protein generated by the vaccine. So the second exposure to that protein means your body comes at it with all force. You may have activated your primary immune system, which are your antibodies, as well as your secondary immune system. And few people explain this to you. You have multiple ways to respond to a vaccine, and the one they target is your IgG or antibodies. But you can also, if you have a robust immune system, have stimulated your secondary system. This is your killer cells, this is your macrophages, and the cellular response is what generally makes you feel bad. They release cytokines and leukocynes, and what this does is it introduces dizziness, sometimes nausea, definitely fatigue, sometimes muscle aches, and it's not uncommon for you to have a dizziness. This is your body's physiologic way of saying, lay down, don't go to work. So when you have a response that the immune system is in control, you will have all of these symptoms. And unfortunately, they're not telling the public that your second shot can give you a 2 to 3 day immune response, fatigue, nausea, loss of appetite, sometimes dizziness. And what does that mean? That means lie down. Don't try to go to work. Don't think you can do business as usual. And this should be an expected precaution given when you're going in for that second jab, as they call it. So that's a scientific explanation of why the second shot can give you a 48-hour to 72-hour feeling of, gee whiz, did I make a mistake? This is terrible. What it's telling you is your body from the first inoculation really activated your immune system. Now, if you're an observer and you haven't been told this, and you go in for the second shot and you think you're going to return to work or go home and cook a dinner or go to a dinner party, you will be very disappointed, and your loved ones can really be uncomfortable seeing just how incapacitated you are. So the answer to your question, a second shot for some people can be expected to require you to slow down and possibly lie down for 48 hours. And that's not
Thank you
considered
so
an
much for
allergic
that
response.
insight.
And it's not considered adverse to most clinicians. They would simply say, you've had a robust immune response.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point that unfortunately has not been emphasized enough, because I can I can say to you with the study that I've done, with all the reports I've read and the videos I've watched on this issue, you know, when I heard this morning that my friend had to be taken to the hospital, you know, when her husband communicated that to me, and he said that they diagnosed, they believe she might have vertigo because she couldn't stand up. You know, he was understandably alarmed, and it made me alarmed, despite the fact that I have been doing all of this reading and listening to, but this is something that is not being widely shared. You know, the fact that this response, which you have just described as a natural response for many folk, can occur, and you know, we shouldn't be alarmed by it.
The way in which
With
I
that,
condition, the way that
go
I
ahead.
condition persons who have decided to take the shot and they're going for Pfizer or Moderna, they've had the first one, they had minimal soreness of the arm and the minimal fatigue. I tell them that, well, you may want to take a Tylenol or some type of anti-muscular, you know, like Motrin or Tylenol before you go in for your second shot, because you would then be mediating your immune response. In other words, you don't get the full-blown attack if you've taken the type of analgesics that can slow things down a bit. So I actually warn people of that second
And I think
shot.
it's also, and is it also important to note that while this can in fact occur with many folk who get that second shot, it doesn't, if you don't experience this, it doesn't mean that the vaccine is not working, because her husband got both shots as she did, but you know, he had soreness and maybe a little bit of fatigue, but that was about it. I mean, she appears to be experiencing the worst of it, but that doesn't suggest that it's working for her and it's not working for him necessarily.
No, what it suggests is that his response was only the antibody response. Remember, I said the body can respond in more than one way. The vaccine intent is to trigger what we call primary immune response, and that's the production of antibodies. But we can't stop a robust response. That if both primary and secondary immune system was triggered, that's just your physiologic difference.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I want to move this conversation into the area of the alternatives, you know, some of the alternatives that are out there. But before we do, I have a little piece of video that I'd like for the audience to take a look at. And this will begin our foray into this other area. If the engineer is ready, you can play that video now. Well, maybe the engineer
Well, while he's
is
setting
not
up,
ready.
you might want to tell your audience the primary spokesperson is also a physician I had followed this physician a year ago. He works in intensive care and he's out of New York State. And I found what he said was quite credible. And I was happy to see him speaking out, because a number of physicians know what we know, but don't say what we say.
The physician is an ICU physician, Dr. Mike Hansen. He, the latter part of the video touches upon monoclonal antibodies. And this is something that you mentioned. In fact, you spoke, quite extensively about it in our previous interview. And the fact that this was something that the President of the United States got when he became ill with this disease. You've mentioned this therapy before. Can you share with the audience again your thoughts on the efficacy of this procedure, how effective it is, and very importantly, especially given the platform we're on, Dr. Boles, could it serve as a potential bridge for hard-hit developing countries like South Africa?
Well, since February 2020, when in New Orleans, Black Americans were dying disproportionately with COVID-19, I set out on a campaign and begged and wrote letters and made requests. Please, can we not use monoclonal antibodies or multiclonal antibodies and protect those who are now dying? And it fell on deaf ears. In 1901, a doctor was awarded the Nobel Prize for identifying that if I, just for example, have antibodies against a disease, you can harvest the antibodies from me and give it to the very sick person, and my antibodies know what to do. It will start attacking whatever could very well be the death of the person who is so very ill. So we know, and that term was called convalescent antibodies, and it was accepted. It was known 120 years ago. And some of you may say, well, what happened to that technology? My answer is nothing. We generate a multivalent antibodies every day. And Regeneron was used as a company name, just like Pfizer, or a product of a company. They used it with Donald Trump. When they said he had COVID-19, they took him into the VA. They gave him an infusion of these antibodies. And 3 days later, he walked out saying, I no longer have COVID-19. We know that these antibodies can do what a person who is very frail or who have comorbidities cannot do. And the reason being, everyone cannot respond to a vaccine, meaning you can give them the injection, but their body cannot mount an antibody defense. So when the objective was all of these senior citizens around Christmas and Thanksgiving and American traditions, those are family times, they were dying in these nursing homes because their visitation from outside family was bringing them a disease, and or the nursing homes did not allow family to visit. And my comment for compassion is, why not offer them the convalescent antibody or monoclonal antibody treatments so that they can be immediately protected? And I hope you know that the vaccine requires 10 to 15 days to begin to be protective, because that's how long it takes you, the person receiving the vaccine, to start making antibodies. But if I infuse antibodies or transfer my antibodies or laboratory created antibodies, you have immediate protection. And that hasn't been used. It's been totally overlooked. And the only time you even heard about it was through Donald Trump. Now, there's a company, Eli Lilly, a long-standing pharmaceutical company, who stepped up just as FDA approved Pfizer for vaccine. Eli Lilly stepped up and said, since the vaccines are not approved for children, because I hope you know, just recently they said 12 and above, but initially it was no one under 16 could take it. Eli Lilly stepped up and said, we will make available these antibodies to any pediatric child who is in need. So we know it's there. It's already FDA approved, but no one, not Dr. Fauci, not any of the CDC, have even offered it as an alternative to the public. And I feel if you were watching, you saw the white female who would stand behind Donald Trump, doctor, who seemed to wince every time Donald Trump said something that didn't really she agree with. She came out to say the first 100,000 people that died in the United States was inevitable. It came at us too fast. But everyone since then, she felt very sad for their families because she was of the opinion some of those deaths could have been prevented. And I thought that was a major comment coming from her. And what I translated, and this is personal, she was saying alternative methods could have saved some people. And when we talk alternative, ivermectin on an international scale have been demonstrated to stop inflammation, slow down the criticality of some respiratory and blood-borne distress, such as dengue fever and other very adverse types of viral infections that we don't see in the Western world or in Britain, but they are still there. And Doctors Without Borders and international doctors will tell you that is a major medication in their arsenal, and it was never offered. We talked about hydrochloroquine, and that was it. But there are proven other alternatives for severe disease that were not implemented in the early stages of COVID-19. So,
and why do you think that is?
It's very political. And unfortunately, I'm going to say it, I think it's all about the money. We know that Dr. Fauci worked at NIH, where Moderna spun out from. We know that Bill Gates has been a spokesperson for all vaccines. So the persons who have taken the lead in vaccination and somehow stopping the pandemic, as they say it, they have a monetary issue in there. Pfizer's stock went up. Moderna's stock went up. When I saw Dr. Fauci present a young Black scientist, female scientist, saying she helped develop the vaccine, I was offended. As if to say, my comment was, I obviously she's intelligent and I hope you paid her well, but what was your message supposed to be? Are you ringing a bell like Pavlov's dogs that all people of color, now we see this young, intelligent Black woman, we need to flock and take the vaccine so Dr. Fauci and others can get rich? I hope you know that when they say $2 billion purchase of Moderna, that's $30 per shot or $60 per treatment that the US government paid the pharmaceutical company for us to be able to go and get what we call free shots. It's not free.
That's right.
They have charged them, and it has been paid. Huh? Excuse me?
Yeah, that's taxpayers' money. Those are taxpayers' dollars. Yes.
Yes, so it's not free. They'll even tell you that in certain parts of the country, there are people black marketing it, that if you can't get the shot through the regular channels, you can get both Pfizer for $100 or $50 a shot. So it is too political and unfortunately very monetized. And that to me breeds distrust. They're not being transparent. They're saying, come and get a free shot. And I'm saying, who says it's free? It's already been $2 billion paid for. It's not free. Pfizer is reacting because they got paid to do it. Moderna is producing not out of some philanthropic and altruistic heartbeat. They are in fact getting paid and have been paid, not getting paid. They had advance payment. So we as consumers too often are goaded into doing things without explanation. And when we question, the news media takes over. It's a form of shaming or blaming. They'll say, oh, well, Black Americans don't trust because. And I'm saying, why are you identifying my distrust? Why don't you talk about your track record? What have you done to motivate this distrust? Have we been lied to before? Have we been misdirected before? So the news media will take over and go through a shame game or a blame game. And then after the news media, now they're going, at least in the areas that I'm familiar, to a lot of the Black churches, and they are paying to have these ministers tell their parishioners what to do. And I recently received I work with nonprofit organizations. They have $50,000 grants available to the 501c3, which is an IRS indication in the US for nonprofit. If they want to do a immunization campaign, they can get grant money. So the question someone asked me recently is, what's with all this money? What's the big incentive? Why are they pushing the money and not looking at the alternative ways to protect people? They're really, really anxious for vaccinations. So I don't have the answer to that question, but the reality is it's happening. People are being paid to influence others to take the vaccines. But there are alternatives.
Now, getting back to the alternatives, is an injection as effective as an infusion of
well, it depends on what you're
convalescent
reading.
antibodies?
Okay. A friend of mine recently called. He's a vet.
So it depends
and
on
he
what?
is a friend of mine who is a veteran. He is service connected with his disabilities, and I treated him when I was still a physician at the VA. So I knew his clinical story. And he called and asked, should I take the vaccine? My answer to him was no. He has too many risk factors for blood clotting and other things. And he says, but I don't want to die. He's 54 years old. He said, what should I do? I advised him to go to the VA hospital and say, I want the same treatment that my commander-in-chief received. And he laughed. He said, what do you mean? I said, no, the medicine that Donald Trump received is totally available and no one's being told to ask for it. So about 90 minutes later, he called me back and he was very excited. He said, Dr. Boles, I got the infusion. I got the infusion and it was no problem. And I'm so excited. Thank you so much. So I told that story to answer your question. If you put the antibodies directly into the bloodstream, that is considered an infusion, and that is usually an IV. Does it take a long time? No. Is it difficult? No. Can anybody get it done? Yes. So the monoclonal antibodies against COVID-19 or any IgG, as we used to call it, gamma globulin transfer, it can be done through IM, it can be done through IV, but in an industrialized country, though neither of those are staggering, and they can be administered quickly. But to answer your question, I think the preferred method in an industrialized country would be IV. But I can tell you, I have personally received gamma globulins in the glutamous maximum. It wasn't a pleasant experience. It was a 2-shot administration, but it was effective in protecting me for the diseases that I was likely to be exposed to.
Okay. Wow. This is an interesting, I mean, really an interesting and from my perspective, a very valuable conversation, because, you know, Doc, there's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of disinformation. There's a lot of conspiracy theory and awash. And, you know, I mean, there's just so much. And there is a legitimate distrust. But one of the things that I find quite interesting about the distrust factor is that I keep hearing these reports that are indicating the most resistant group of folk in the public square against the vaccines, the most resistant group of folk are white Republican males.
Well, they're starting to change.
In large part under. Okay, go ahead.
That's starting to change. I was in a seminar early this morning, and part of the statistics that are starting to show for these new strains is it is hitting very hard the 28 to 40-year-olds. And they are the productive part of the society, and that's why they're highlighting it. It's not the 50 to 60-year-olds, which you might say at the 70 and 80s were the one dying in January a year ago. Now we'd hit the next group. No, it jumped a group, and the group is now making very ill, not just, a little bit of sick. They are fully symptomatic. They're the ones that are now requiring respirator and intensive care type surveillance. And that is in response to what they're calling the P1 or Brazilian variant. That what's going on in Brazil is overwhelming. And it is that variant that seems to be dominating. And I need to let you know that variant is not just in Brazil. We have P1 in the United States. We have the UK variant, which they're calling B117. It is also in the United States. The South African 501Y, and they just had a new one, I think it's Y sub 2. Those are very similar. If you're doing any type of genetic mapping, the type of mutations seen in these very aggressive variants are relatively in the same area. If I were talking to a geneticist, he would get excited and say, no, it's not. But to lay people and us who do not do the genetic mapping, they are very similar. And what they give this virus is an ability to attach and infect at a much higher rate than what the original strain. Now, before I keep going, I just occurred to me another question that's often asked when we start talking about variants. Why do we have mutations? All is necessary for this virus to mutate is for it to have a chance to replicate. Now, that sounds like some kind of a googly talk, but what that means is anytime this virus can infect many humans, I'm going to use just generic terms and say the virus gets smarter. So if it only affects one human and we stop it, then we can say it's not a pandemic. If it infects, let's say, 1,000 people, now we get concerned because there is 1,000 chances for that virus to get smart enough to beat whatever defensive humans have. Because keep in mind, coronavirus is not new. It's generally in animals. And they talk about bats, but you have to know the feline or the cat does also harbor coronaviruses. So what became an issue is when the coronavirus crossed into human population and started wreaking havoc. What this corona is called a beta class, because there's many classes of coronavirus, crossed into the human population, first documented was about 14 years ago. And that was what they call SARS-1. It didn't become a pandemic because it didn't show up around the world. Now that SARS-2, which we're calling COVID-19, is showing up around the world, the chance of these new variants are most concerning because they could become human specific, meaning not animal, but human specific. And that's the big rush to get. Can we stop it from replicating? How do you stop it from replicating? You give people an immunity against it, and that's what you hear when you hear herd immunity. If we can get it such that this virus cannot make humans sick because they are already protected, then we slow down the chance of a mutation. And that's why I'm shocked that we're not using every possible avenue to stop infection. And that would include the antibodies.
what is the immunity shelf life for the vaccines, and what is the shelf life for the monoclonal antibodies?
Excellent question. When we talk about, and I know shelf life, what you mean is how long are we protected? Sometimes you hear about
Right.
vaccines can give you lifetime protection. What that really is, putting it in layman terms, it means what type of antibody did your vaccine trigger? And there's 5 types of antibodies if you ever want to take a course in immunology. The ones that are relevant is the I, little g, big G, for those who want to go check this conversation. The IgG is your first line. That's what goes out and starts fighting immediately. Then we create something called an IgM. The M is memory. That's a good way to remember it. And the IgM is your long-term memory immunoglobulin. So if I were to check your serology and I wanted to know, have you been protected, I would look for IgG and I look at IgM. IgG, if it's high, means you have just gotten over the attack or you are still fighting. If the IgG is relatively low, but the IgM is high, it means you have a good memory of this disease. So that would mean long-term protection. So everybody do not generate a lot of IgMs. And that's, again, when you were making the husband-wife comparison, if my body can generate a lot of IgMs and yours do not, then my susceptibility is better. I won't get it. My protection may be lifelong and yours is shorter lived. A good example how we just accept that casually is a tetanus. If you ever step on a nail or cut your foot, the first question they say is, when's the last time you had a tetanus shot?
Right.
And if you say, oh, it's been 10, 12 years, what do they say? You need a booster. So we are familiar with what I'm talking about, but we don't always know how to apply it to this new condition. Now, to answer your question, monoclonal antibodies that are not made by you are generally cleared from your body in 3 to 6 months. So it does not give you lifelong protection, but it gives you immediate protection.
Okay, Dr. Boles, we have 9 minutes left in this program. And I don't know, I'm sure that you're aware of the fact that according to the experts out there who have been following this pandemic globally and charting its its development and just how it's been expanding in different parts of the world, and the global community's response to it, what they're saying is that officially South Africa is the hardest hit country on the African continent with this virus right now. South Africa is the hardest hit on the African continent. And there's also been some bit of debate and discussion and controversy around some vaccines that South Africa was supposed to have had that it didn't use. It's about to sell, and they're going to be using Johnson & Johnson instead. Some controversies around that. What is your advice, given the fact that this is a platform coming out of South Africa? But
well, the first comment I would like to make is I did some homework because I have other interests on the continent of Africa. My reading is there's 54 countries on the continent of Africa. The first shout out should be a salute to South Africa in that their health services are actually testing and reporting. So many of the other 54 countries are not. And some are in abject denial. They're saying it's not here. We don't have COVID. And despite deaths, they're not treating for COVID. So I think why South Africa may be looked at as being hardest hit may be because they are actually looking. You know, it's kind of like you're cleaning your home. If you don't look under the bed,
Right.
you don't know how dirty or what dust balls are there. So if you're not checking, if you're not testing, you
Right.
don't know. So I can't make a comparison across the continent of Africa among all of the countries, but South Africa has been testing, and they have been doing serology. So again, clinically, from my PhD side, I salute the South African healthcare persons, because unlike America, who were simply looking, PCR is the nasal swab process, and they were simply saying, yes, you have COVID, no, you don't. In other countries, such as South Africa and then the UK as well, they looked at, do you have COVID and what does it look like genetically? And that's how the South African strain was identified. So it appeared, for whatever reason, the South African strain has been rapidly communicating. Now, they do say it's more contagious and it targets younger people. So with those two parameters in place, South Africa will appear ravaged because it has a very aggressive strain and is targeting your most productive population. So with that clarification, what I would say to South Africa, the data shows Johnson & Johnson has been effective against the South African strain. How do I know that? Some of the clinical trials that Johnson & Johnson conducted was in South Africa, unlike some of the other products. So AstraZeneca has had a bit of a black eye because of the blood clots that you've seen. I think it's either in Sweden or Switzerland, and they're trying to downplay it to say it's 2 cases per million of vaccine. And from a clinical point of view, they say benefits more than, it's better than the risks of getting COVID and dying. But if I were advising, as you've asked me to, I would tell the South African people that the only vaccine that I am aware of that has shown both efficacy and effectiveness with preventing death. Now that's a key, the perspective of what is this vaccine supposed to do? I didn't say it prevents all infection. I said it prevents death. So those who would be at risk for severe infection resulting in severe consequences such as stroke, pneumonia, or death, Johnson & Johnson has shown that that vaccine can prevent those extreme reactions.
Okay, excellent. And what are your parting words to your fellow Americans 1 year into this pandemic, and especially to the members of your tribe, African Americans? What
I'm going to
are
talk
your
to my
parting
Black
words?
Americans, and those who have heard me will hear the same thing. We should not simply fall in line like sheep and line up to do what our various persons are pressuring us to do. You need to be clear about your medical status. We do not know if you have diabetes, hypertension, asthma, allergic response to food or medications, how this vaccine can affect you. We are seeing 10-day, 20-day out responses. So without the government assuring us that we have continued surveillance for the marginalized person, what do I mean? You don't have health care and your primary reaction is emergency room care. We need to have some kind of surveillance mechanism in place by the Biden-Harris COVID-19 program that says if a complication arises down the road, you have access to support and health care. So that would be my comment. We need to keep fighting and not simply take the vaccine and think everything's all right. And if something arises later, you say, well, it's my problem. I'm trying to motivate you to say, I know my body better than anyone else, and I'm here to take care of me. And that should be your mantra. I want to take care of me.
And that is a beautiful note to end on, an uplifting note to end on. I want to thank you once again, Dr. Velva Boles, for joining us on this Salam Media platform, this specific program, a conversation with your brother, El-Hajj Mauri Salaakhan. It has been a delight for me. I have, each time we are able to converse publicly, or, our little conversations we have from time to time over the phone, I always walk away more informed, and I'm just I'm so glad and proud to have sisters on the block, such as my sister, Dr. Velva Boles. Thank you again for joining us. And
well, my last request is, if
Yes.
anyone has benefited from this, tell a friend, take an action. Don't just hear it and say that was a good talk. Go out and make a difference and save someone's life.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, sister. And may the rest of your day be blessed. I don't know how the weather is in Louisiana right now,
lovely.
but
yes.
Okay, well, enjoy that lovely day.
Yes.
And
thank you ever so much.
All right.
All right.
All
Bye.
right. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr, which means, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, by the token of time through the ages, verily humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good, and exhort one another to truth, and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.